Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? First, we have news on the new strains of the CCP virus. Then we have news on whether or not your sperm may indicate whether or not children will have autism. Finally, confirmation that America may be funding the World Health Organization after the middle of this year. Going to the first news for this week, we should talk about the new strains of the CCP virus and how they are very quickly overtaking what could be considered the original. The biggest concern is primarily the UK variant as opposed to the South African or Brazilian. The concern behind this and the primary driving force is that it's anticipated that in a little over a month and a half, it could easily overtake as the predominant source or variant of the CCP virus infecting people. That is roughly 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and we are only sitting at 76 cases today. Consider how many people in America are infected at the moment. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And this one variant will balloon in 6 weeks to overtake that, from less than 1%. This otherwise unprecedented growth rate is based on two propositions. One, that the current number of infections represents approximately 0.5% of all US cases. Second, that this particular variant is 50% more infectious than the original. Those two assumptions underlie the fact that it will only take a few brief weeks to catch up and then surpass the current infection rate. The impact of the CCP virus is being felt in other ways in America, and specifically in California. In California, the number of deceased is skyrocketing, and this is one big problem. How do you dispose of all the people who have died? For the most part, normal burials aren't an option, if only because the bodies are a biological hazard. The most efficient and effective means of disposing of the deceased in this case is cremation. The problem then is that the crematorium facilities are at their maximum capacity already. Bodies are effectively piling up in morgues. Los Angeles doesn't want to do what Brazil and other countries have had to do and bring in portable cold storage in an attempt to try and keep the bodies safe until they can be disposed of. This is where the news of LA County's decision comes in. The South Coast Air Quality Management body has said that they're going to approve the number of cremations to be increased. The number is normally capped based on the impact it has on air quality. The problem is, it's now a question of between air quality impact and the impact on the ability to provide somewhere to store the deceased. As a result, there has been a temporary increase in the permit capacity. As of the end of last week, and we're unsure of the impact of this decision this week, there are a little under 3,000 bodies waiting to be disposed of. This is spread across 28 crematoriums. This is yet another, less foreseeable, but sorely felt impact of the CCP virus. The ability to see off loved ones, friends and family in at least a somewhat respectable manner, rather than leaving them to wait in the cold. While on the topic of family, friends and loved ones, we should mention the impact of their crotch goblins. A very large study of people in India has found that children are the primary driver of infection, which is an interesting phenomenon. To put this in better context, they looked at 500,000 people and they tried to figure out who they were exposed by when it came to the CCP virus. What they found was that children and young adults, although more resilient to the virus when they were infected, were also able to infect more people. This impact was felt more acutely in the house than it was outside of it. While on the topic of diseases, but veering away from viruses, we should look at bacteria and antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance is a concern, if not as pressing as is initially thought. The problem is we didn't exactly understand how quickly antibiotic resistance will spread between one bacterium species and another. That's where research like this helps. Knowing just how much time we have, at least in theory, based on reliable modeling, for one particular strain of bacteria to spread resistance to other bacteria for a given antibiotic means that we can plan accordingly, try and properly account for when and how to use different medications, and what areas to focus new efforts on. One of the ways that bacteria can pick up antibiotic resistance from other bacteria is by transferring DNA horizontally. This occurs in various ways, but for the most part it involves taking a small circular section of DNA, taking it from one bacterium, inserting it into the other, allowing it to unravel into a linear length, and then inserting itself. This is called a plasmid. The plasmid, though, needs to find a way to insert itself into an area of DNA that it matches to at each end. The research that's behind this has indicated several problems to our initial models that have given us a lot more time to work with. The first is simply that there appear to be more of these possible genes that could be transferred across, and in fact twice as many as thought. Second, that the sequences in which they can bind to a new host and incorporate into the DNA appear to not be as specific as we thought. This means that not only are there twice as many as anticipated, but they can go into more places than we initially considered. This means there's more flexibility, and it amplifies the number of ways and times an antibiotic gene could be incorporated and spread to new possible hosts. While on the topic of transferring genetic material and more, we should talk about two case studies that have been published recently. They involve inhaling cancer cells from a mother during vaginal birth. That is, the baby picked up cancer from the mother simply by being born. This is an incredibly rare event and very unlikely to come up again anytime soon, but the case study is interesting. It comes from Japan, where doctors are reporting on what they describe as vaginal transmission of cancer cells from mothers with cervical cancer to infants at the moment of their birth. The unfortunate reality behind this case study is that it involved two young males, a 23-month-old and a 6-year-old, both of whom developed lung cancer as a result of exposure to cervical cancer during birth. The treatment for these two was thankfully successful, but not without cost. The 23-month-old and the 6-year-old both had to have chemotherapy. The 23-month-old had to have a lobe of their lung taken out, and the 6-year-old needed his entire left lung removed. This is not something any child should have to go through. You may initially wonder, how did they know that this was linked to the mother's cancer? And that is solved very simply. Genetic testing identified a series of similarities, but that could just be random chance. The final nail in the coffin of this particular claim is that the mutated cancerous cells did not have a Y chromosome. This means they were female cells, and in this case could only have come directly from the mother. While still on the topic of children and conception, we want to talk about another study yet again, this one looking at autism and predicting whether or not children will have it based on sperm. Identifying whether or not a child has autism can be difficult. There are studies showing significantly successful efforts in identifying autistic traits in the brain well before birth. These, though, are not necessarily the best option. They require somewhat discomforting and rather difficult testing to be done. More efficient, effective, and less awkward testing has been tried. Some of these have been successful, some of them have not. This study looked at a very small cohort, but they found that they had a 90% accuracy. It used 26 fathers and tried to identify biomarkers associated with autism. They were specifically looking at the sperm rather than the fathers themselves. The idea is to develop a test that they can run on a much larger, preferably population-sized cohort, and try and figure out whether or not the variety of markers they've found, and there are over 800, could possibly be an indicator of whether or not someone will father autistic offspring. It's worth remembering that autism has a very strong heritability association with the father over the mother in most cases, and in this case, that is why they are looking at sperm from the father. While on the topic of health and clinical studies, we should talk about America's choice to commit itself to the World Health Organization again. As with most government changes, when one administration goes out and another comes in, they will have differing priorities. The fact that President Trump did not see fit to want to fund the World Health Organization based on a variety of issues from the CCP virus, and now Biden's re-entry as president has given rise to some conflict. President Biden has stated that he believes that it should be an ally as an organization, not an adversary. He believes the World Health Organization plays a crucial role in dealing with a vast number of diseases. These especially cover global health and health security. Whilst changes in administration will inevitably lead to situations like this, there is something of a spectre hanging over the Biden administration. Primarily, how will they deal with the way the World Health Organization has handled the breakout of the CCP virus across the world, and particularly how difficult China is making getting into Wuhan to investigate the origin and hopefully an original sample of the virus, with the intent to be able to do something about it. Our final news item for this week has to do with starfish, and a disease that's been breaking out amongst them. Since 2013, sea stars or starfish have been experiencing large die-offs due to a mystery disease. It is symptomatic of the body of the starfish shriveling, limbs breaking away, and the bodies melting into a goo. If that image isn't horrifying enough, we weren't entirely sure exactly what was happening. Normally a starfish can begin rebuilding itself if it takes some degree of damage. Limbs will grow back and possibly a new starfish from removed limbs. The fact that not only were they not growing back, but effectively melting meant that this was something more serious. 7 years later, we have a much better idea of what's happening, and it owes to a mismatch in the bacteria within these starfish. What happens is normally most organisms will have some mixture of microorganisms within them. This helps with a variety of things. There will also be some on them. The number and nature of the bacteria, both inside and outside the animals, is often indicative of their health. Consider what happens if you have food poisoning. Your own naturally occurring gut flora get out of hand and cause you to become sick. In this case, the starfish had a particular microorganism known as copiotrophs. Copiotrophs are bacteria that like to live in a high nutrient environment, such as what a melting starfish would be made from. When these starfish were in water that lacked oxygen, their tissues began to melt and lesions would form in about 75%. When you add in the copiotrophs, you begin to find that the starfish begins to melt. This is because the small amount of oxygen that the starfish keeps around itself in order to breathe is being used by the copiotrophs. This means that the starfish suffocates, can't replace the oxygen because there's none in the water that they can use, and begins dying. This situation was compounded by warming water temperatures. When you start adding phytoplanktons to the environment, you find that you get more nitrogen being generated in the water. This creates a problem where the water, or at least the oxygen in it, is displaced by the nitrogen. This means there's less oxygen available for the starfish. The starfish become weak and ill. The copiotrophs begin to eat the breaking down starfish. The starfish become even more ill, but the breakdown of them creates more nutrition for the copiotrophs, and this creates a rather devastating loop. As has been noted in the study, this can be a very alarming signal for what the future may hold, based on what we know of some of our more advanced and complicated life cycles in the world. Some of them follow a very similar pattern of one species relying on another, but being able to take advantage of a sick or weak species. Those are all the news items we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.